All right, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us to celebrate Photographic Presidents, Making History from Daguerreotype to Digital. My name is Heather, and I'm the Publicity Manager at the University of Illinois Press. And I'm just going to go over some brief logistical information and introduce our guests before we get started. First of all, thank you so much to Dr. Finnegan and Dr. Shaw for being here today. They're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for a 20-minute Q&A at the end. You can enter questions throughout the event by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use promo code FIN40 to get a 40% discount on the book on the University of Illinois Press website. The promo code and a link to the book can be found in the chat box. We will also be recording the event and posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards. You'll receive an email from Zoom after the event that will have both the discount code and a link to our YouTube channel as well. And now I will just briefly introduce our guests. Cara Finnegan is a professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and sole author of 3 books, 2 of them published by the University of Illinois Press: Making Photography Matter, A Viewer's History from the Civil War to the Great Depression, and Photographic Presidents, which we are here to celebrate today. Michael Shaw is a clinical psychologist and publisher of Reading the Pictures, the visual literacy and media literacy nonprofit dedicated to the daily analysis of news images. He also writes and lectures on visual politics and photojournalism, and his work has been featured in publications such as the Columbia Journalism Review, the New York Times Magazine, the New Republic, Salon, Quartz, and American Photo. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Finnegan and Dr. Shaw. Thanks again to everyone for being here today.
Well, I wanted to say how excited I am to be here and how interested, excited, and amazed I am by this book. It's a really interesting way to approach photography. It's something that puts it into a different context than I'm used to approaching, and it's different than what Cara and I do when we look at photographs in real time. So I'm honored to be here. Why don't we start with that quintessential question? Cara, what made you decide to write this book?
Yeah, that is the question, isn't it? After you spend all these years working on a project. It's so much fun to be here with you, Michael, and thank you so much. Thanks to all the folks at the press, and thanks to everybody who's here and participating. There'll be Q&A moments at the end, so if you have a Q&A question, as we are chatting away, feel free to document it and we'll get to it later. Yeah, it's so good to be here with Michael, because Michael is somebody who I have been having a kind of ongoing conversation with about photography this whole time, but we haven't really talked very much about this book. So let's get to that first question. Why did I decide to write this book? I think a couple of reasons. The first is the idea for the book really came out of my teaching. I developed a course called Visual Politics about 12 years ago, and was teaching that sort of at the end of the Bush administration and at the beginning of the Obama administration. And as things transitioned to Obama in early 2009, they, at the White House, at the Obama White House, started doing something really interesting, which is they started putting the official White House photographs they were making, which White House photographers had made for years. They started putting them online, almost in real time on this social media site, Flickr. And I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about Flickr later. But that seemed different in ways that I thought were really interesting. And so as I was working through some of these images with my students, my undergraduates in the visual politics class, I did the kind of professor thing where I thought, okay, I need to find some kind of source that gives them some background on the history of presidents and photography. And there was some stuff, but there wasn't actually a lot. There was some great work by David Lubin, the art historian, who wrote a wonderful book on Kennedy called Shooting Kennedy, about Kennedy and photography and culture. There were a few other things like that out there, but there really wasn't kind of anything with the scope, that I really wanted to see. So that was one thing. And then the second thing was that I got interested in presidents and photography a little bit more as I was working on my book that Heather mentioned, Making Photography Matter. I had a chapter in that book on Lincoln, and specifically on how viewers in the late 19th century responded to what was then a newly discovered daguerreotype, an early photograph of Abraham Lincoln. And that made me realize that, there's a lot more to presidential photography than just pictures of presidents. So I would sort of flag those two moments as pretty key for me in this project.
So you came to this project not as a historian of the presidency, but as a historian of photography and a communication scholar. So how does that make this book different from other work on presidential images?
One of the things I really wanted to do, as I was saying, was I wanted to think about photography and the presidency in a different way than simply, kind of cataloging maybe famous images of presidents, right? The kinds of presidents you might think of as being especially photogenic. What I really wanted to do was I wanted to use the presidents almost as a lens for understanding kind of key moments in the development of the history of photography. So one of the things that I discovered pretty quickly, particularly when I dug into 19th century presidential photography, which has really not been taken up much, in the way that I was interested in it. When I started digging into that, what I realized was that at all of these moments where photography was changing, where it was being introduced, initially in the United States in 1839 and moving into the 1840s. And then later when, other technological changes in photography made it new again. At each of these moments, presidents were kind of there, like they were really key players in these moments. So I started, in some ways I kind of, I thought of it as, how presidents were becoming photographic. So you had photographs of presidents, but the title of the book really comes from this idea of, at each of these moments, presidents are becoming photographic in different ways because the medium itself is always changing.
A key through line of the book is your reminder that what we think of as old media were once new media, that, new media is ubiquitous. And that presidents have always been adopters of new media and specifically use the term canaries in the coal mine in terms of that role status challenge. So you organize the book through those moments where these presidents encountered or sometimes clashed with changes in the medium of photography. And so you create sections: the daguerreotype president, the snapshot president, the candid camera president, and the social media president. So let's talk through a few examples from the book by highlighting some key photographs through these different categories. First
yeah,
off,
I'm gonna share the screen here. So folks should be seeing now just the cover of the book, hopefully.
Great. So going back to the foundation of the country, George Washington left office in 1797, and he had died in 1799. But it's not true that he was passed over by photography, is it?
No, not at all. And that was actually one of the kind of fun discoveries of this project, was realizing that George Washington lived into the era of photography in all these really interesting ways. Yeah. And if you look on the lap of this mother featured in this daguerreotype with her daughter, who is gazing lovingly at George Washington's portrait, you might notice, if you can kind of see upside down, that that's actually probably one of the most famous portraits of George Washington, the so-called Athenaeum Portrait. And that's the portrait of Washington that we're pretty familiar with today because it's on our dollar bill. And so this portrait in particular became a kind of subject of photography in this early period, where the daguerreotype, which was a one-of-a-kind mirrored photograph, one of the first types of photographs, and really the first kind of photography to become popular in the United States, Washington gets pictured via daguerreotype in a couple of different ways, and this is one example of that. So what I found is that you have Washington kind of living on into the photographic era through these kind of visual associations with him as, you know, the father of the country. He's very much culturally the icon of the nation at this point, still many decades after his death. And so images like this featuring live people kind of worshiping at the altar of Washington. There's other photos I have in the book of children kind of lovingly hugging busts of George Washington. I mean, you see it and you kind of laugh out loud because it seems so over the top. But the idea was just to associate Washington and photography. I think partly to kind of authorize photography itself, to prove that photography was a kind of worthy art. You had to have pictures of like the guy who was, you know, most worthy at the time.
So it's more, in a way, he was enabling and empowering photography as more than perhaps the other way around.
I think that's arguably the case. You know, I've talked a little bit in other places about how photography needed the presidents. And I think that's especially the case with early photography, that to photograph Washington was definitely to associate him with this new exciting, you know, this new medium, but it was also a way of justifying the value of photography itself, very much so.
In the daguerreotype president, you primarily focus on John Quincy Adams. I find it so interesting that we're looking at a renowned presidential photograph dating from 1843, when Adams left office in 1829. Given your interest in how presidents became photographic, Adams was something of a perfect subject and narrator for you, wasn't he?
Yeah, he really was, for a lot of reasons. And my friends will tell you that I became a little bit obsessed with John Quincy Adams during this project. First of all, I mean, look at this daguerreotype. Isn't it the most beautiful thing you've ever seen? In his gaze, he's just leaping off the screen at you, right? He is so full of himself in every way. So Adams is interesting and important for a couple of reasons. The first reason, which is actually to me the less interesting reason, is that when Adams was a former president, as you point out, in 1843, he sat for this image, which we now know is the earliest existing photograph of a president. William Henry Harrison was photographed in 1841, before he died. He's the guy who died super soon after his inauguration. But that daguerreotype doesn't survive. And just very recently, in like 2016 or 2017, this daguerreotype was discovered and became the new oldest picture of an existing picture of a president. The previous one was another daguerreotype of John Quincy Adams. So he still retained his status, which I'm sure would be very important to him. So that's one reason why this image is really important. But the other reason is that with Adams, we actually get to see him up close become photographic, because he kept a diary nearly every day of his adult life. He chronicled the most mundane things that anybody might chronicle in their diary. And one of the things he did was he chronicled his first visits to the daguerreotypist. Over the course of the last 6 years of his life, if you rely on the diary as a good source, which I do because he was so regular with his diary, he sat for probably about 50 daguerreotypes over maybe a dozen or so sittings. And he wrote about his experience. So you go with him, you know, the first time he is photographed by daguerreotype in 1842, and he describes going to the top of this building and being put in what he called a kind of round greenhouse, which was basically a big room with big windows so that you could have enough light in to create the exposure to make the image. He talked about the camera by describing it as a telescope. So he's using all of these different analogies to try to really just figure out, what is this thing that I'm being subjected to? What is this thing that people are inviting me to sit for? Because he was an elite person. And so people wanted him, right? If they needed Washington, they definitely also needed someone like Adams, who was a living link to the founding of the nation. So So we get this really up close, intimate example of Adams. And then the other thing that I just thought was really interesting about Adams and why he kind of became the centerpiece of that section of the book is because he was not really that much of a fan of photography. He didn't think that it was a mode of portraiture that, to use his words, would transmit the memory of a man to the next age, is like something like what he said. And so I think what he meant there was, while today we see the gravitas and the kind of power and the self-possession in an image like this, what Adams saw was something that, first of all, depicted him as an old man, and he didn't really like that. You want to be depicted in the fullness of your power, not in your decline. But also, this is someone who had been depicted in basically every other visual medium for his whole life. And so he just kind of found photography wanting. And that was really, really interesting to me.
Yeah, and it's really great how you really draw out how much he thought about the dynamics of representation and raised questions that, I think we're reading and seeing a lot today. So, I mean, there's something really prescient in him really trying to wrap his head around what it meant to be this like subject and object, and then how it mediated. So, and I think you really delve into that, and it's really, worth the, the exploration.
Yeah, he really becomes kind of a voice, and he's kind of my presidential voice in terms of being photographed. There's there's a few other things here and there in the book, but really we get his deep kind of personal thoughts about what these experiences were like, and that was really cool to me. It was also really fun to it was great to be able to read the digitized version of his diary, so thank you Massachusetts Historical Society for that. But then I also had to learn how to read his handwriting because they're digitized in his handwriting, and that was fun. You get to know someone in a very personal way when you read a lot of their handwriting.
So many elements are in play 60 years later when you make the jump to what you coin the snapshot president, and that includes the existence of a photo press, the familiarity of press imagery and press competition, and the early stage of personal photography. So can you set the stage a little bit before we talk specifically about William McKinley?
Yeah, so because the book is interested in these moments where photography is transforming, and then we're looking at what presidents are doing at those moments, there's leaping forward in history a little bit, and folks who've seen the book will notice that I have what I came to kind of think of in my mind as kind of interchapters, shorter chapters between the bigger analysis chapters about the presidents, where I kind of say, okay, so here's what's going on in photography and the culture, and here's what's going on kind of in general up to this next moment. So what's going on in general up to this next moment, which takes us essentially to the very beginning of the 20th century, and William McKinley, is photography is becoming more portable. Cameras are becoming smaller. The smallness of cameras is producing anxiety about what people come to call camera fiends, which is kind of a term that's a little bit like a paparazzi. Just the idea that now by the late 20th century, cameras are small enough that you could be photographed on the street by one and maybe not even really know it. So film is changing, cameras are changing, but it's not just the technology that's changing, it's people's expectations of what photographs can do and be. And the places where people are finding photographs are changing too. So by the 1880s and into the 1890s, you can now publish pretty good quality images, photographs in newspapers and magazines. So by the time we get to McKinley, we have, in what I call, in the snapshot era, we have what I call the rise of timely photography, where you've got the beginnings of a little bit of photojournalism, and you have this kind of public expectation that a camera should be able to capture something around it pretty easily, and that a newspaper and a magazine should be able to report visually what's going on. So then we get to McKinley, and McKinley is an interesting figure because for most of the chapter I have about McKinley, he is dying or dead. And that is because what became really compelling to me about this moment of the snapshot and the timely photography, is that when McKinley is shot and then he dies about a week later in Buffalo, New York, he's shot in a public space at a public event at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901. He's been there for a big speech. He's gone around, he's visited Niagara Falls, he's gone around and done all these different things. And he is shot by an assassin, and then he is essentially removed to the home of a powerful citizen of Buffalo, where he dies about a week later. So McKinley becomes photographic in his after the shooting and in his death, because this push for the timely photography means that everyone wants the last photograph of McKinley. And there's some question that the newspapers seem to be asking about whether it would have been possible to photograph the moment of the shooting. And so this question of the last photographs of McKinley becomes a way to think through this idea of, what is this timely photography?
Yeah, this reminded me about or took me back to the first section about George Washington, that in some way it's much easier to understand the dynamics of the medium if you take the subject out of the picture.
Yeah. Yeah, poor McKinley is literally out of the picture.
Yeah, but I mean, these two photographs are really interesting. The fact that the act itself wasn't visually recorded does facilitate a deeper understanding of the role of presidential photography. It's hard not to look at these pictures in now and not think of, or at least for me, not think of the picture of JFK, lying on the ground of that ballroom in Los Angeles. So, but this really this was really a seminal moment at the time in terms of the fact relative to what they did capture. And who captured these images, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what ended up happening was there was some conversation about, well, if someone had been there at the moment of the shooting, and if they had had a camera, and if the lighting had been correct, and if the person had had the presence of mind, and if all of the universe had aligned, maybe we could have had a photograph of this image. So what became really interesting about that, or photograph, of the shooting. So what becomes really interesting about that is that it's like the medium, people's expectations for the medium exceed the technology's capacities at that point. So they essentially are like, well, we could have had it, but we don't have it. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to just show every other possible last photograph of McKinley. And so it was this weird kind of race to publish the last photographs of McKinley. This one, if folks can see the caption on the bottom, this was an image from the Library of Congress, and this was a caption that was provided by the photographer. The last photograph of President McKinley by his own permission. So people started doing things like, well, I have the last photograph of McKinley in this specific way, right? Like, he told me I could take it. This photo actually doesn't look like that's the case, but so what you get is this interest in what are the last moments of this really significant person's life. And if we don't have that moment where he has been shot, if the timely photograph isn't really that timely after all, or not timely enough, then you get these kind of what Barbie Zolliser at Penn has called about to die photographs, right? So you get these images that are very poignant because in this case, this is an amateur snapshot of McKinley literally before he walks into this event. So yeah, his absence becomes the story of photography in that moment, for sure.
It's really interesting how, when we're talking about Washington, and you made the point that his who he was and his death, and then the amount of time since between the founding of photography and the time that Washington lived, that his presence really authorized photography. But at this point, it seems like the shoe's very much on the other foot. And then what's also interesting to me, and maybe it's just kind of because of the stuff we do and how much we look at photography today, but this also seems to start to talk about, predates Life magazine, and that this authorizes now, or kind of ushers in photography as a narrative, or as a, where you start to build a story based on what it is you have.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are definitely, in the context of the McKinley assassination, there are these kind of, you might almost call them kind of memory features that are these photo stories where they collect together a lot of these last photographs. Yeah. And as we move into the era, further into the early 20th century, into the Candid era, these sorts of images, right, become more common. And then you also have, like you said, Life magazine, you have these other outlets where the circulation of these kinds of images becomes, even more widespread.
So let's talk about the Candid camera presidents. And you focus primarily on Hoover and on FDR. And so by the late 30s, the prominence of the photograph had drastically raised the bar when it came to how presidents were both seen and perceived. So can you explain to us a little bit about how much the technology had to do with it, and also how and how the culture or the institution of the presidency placed a premium on what you call visual values?
Yeah, so by the time we get to the late 1920s and into the 1930s, we have the rise of the so-called Candid era, and the introduction of even more portable cameras that shoot roll film, that don't need a lot of light, right? You don't have to have a giant flashbulb that explodes in people's faces anymore. You can use the natural light that's in a room. All of these things kind of participate in this moment where we get essentially the introduction of 35 millimeter photography. So the kind of photography that, if you were born in the late 20th century was just photography, might be the camera that your parents had at home, is the new kind of photography. And the way it gets practiced, you mentioned these visual values, the way it comes to get practiced is through what I call the visual values of access, intimacy, and energy. So this is a photograph that I'll explain in a moment a little bit about the context, but this is a photograph by a guy named Erich Salomon, who was a German photographer who was really kind of the pioneer of the so-called Candid photograph. And what Salomon would do is he would visit diplomatic events, and he would kind of walk around and get these photos of people kind of doing the work of politics in the back room, smoking their cigars, sitting around tables, having conversations. And the images he made just really kind of blew people away. And these diplomats and politicians really liked them too, because they felt like they showed, this candid, kind of interesting way that politics was getting done. They weren't these staid portraits. So this image kind of, to me, represents what I like to think of maybe as a candid fail, because to be a successfully photographed candid subject, you had to adopt the norms of candid photography. In other words, you had to not pose, you had to pretend to focus on other things, you had to essentially be available for photography without acting like you were aware you were being photographed. And so this is an image of Pierre Laval from France, who is visiting the White House, and you see Herbert Hoover there. And one of them is not like the other, right? Hoover doesn't quite get the memo on how to be candid. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that this is a moment where presidents are having to navigate what this new thing, these candid visual values, access, intimacy, energy, what these kinds of images are going to mean for them as presidents. And so this really ups the ante in terms of the question of Yes, I want visual coverage of me, and I want to build my political image, and photography is definitely a way to do that. But no, I would like control over how I'm represented, and I'm nervous, right? The candid camera makes me nervous. So this image of Hoover is sort of an example of that. And I wanted to toss in another image of Hoover made by Eric Solomon to kind of show you the difference of what the candid image kind of could achieve when it was really truly candid. And this is an image that Solomon made surreptitiously. He reportedly hid a camera in a flower pot at a White House Correspondents' Dinner, where, by the way, no one was supposed to be making photographs, so he got in trouble for that. And this is actually a pretty great image of Hoover. If you study images of Hoover, which sadly I have looked at many of them, and here you really kind of get the sense of what candid is. It gives you, you get a little bit of insight, I think, into Hoover. You see him in an environment where he's not paying attention to who's photographing him or why. It's not a photo op. And so just this juxtaposition of these two images gives you a little bit of insight, I think, into what Candid was going for and the ways that, you know, presidents had to kind of deal with that. Because now, of course, this great Candid image is also an image that Hoover would not have wanted made because it was essentially stolen.
And again, it's really interesting where, you know, you're juxtaposing FDR with Hoover, and we really learn more about Hoover, I think, because of the flaws and really his comparative difficulty or less of a comfort level and ability to control the photo medium, as opposed to, you know, when we FDR and, you know, and the powerful impression that and impressions that he created. But when we think about photography and FDR, I think now it seems that the depiction of his disability is what typically comes to mind. But visual management at the time was more, you know, encompassing, wasn't it?
When I started working with FDR, I expected that I would be reading and thinking a lot about the question of his disability and you know, the narratives, which for the most part are the case, that there were quasi-written and definitely unwritten rules about picturing him in certain moments, right? Picturing him in ways that highlighted his disability. For example, being wheeled in a wheelchair or photographing him so that his leg braces would show. And the photo press largely went along with that. But what became really interesting to me was that arguably the White House was just as worried about the same candid camera stuff that everybody else would have been worried about. So this is the cover of a story called "Why the Candid Camera Was Barred from the White House," and this appeared in Popular Photography in 1937. And it's this, you know, kind of like tongue-in-cheek investigation, right, of this question of why the White House was not happy about candid photographs of FDR. And it really came down to, again, that question of control of the image and not wanting to be made a visual fool of. So images of FDR, you know, enjoying himself at a baseball game, if you blow up a 35mm image and, you know, now we would call it pixelated, but, you know, the resolution gets bad, he's fuzzy, he does not look good, right? And people thought he was ill. There was always concern about his health and how he looked, even in the earlier period of his presidency like this. So that's a cause for anxiety. And then there's also, there was this kind of odd narrative that kept recurring about photographs of FDR eating a hot dog, right? That it was just unseemly to photograph the president chewing food, eating a hot dog at a Democratic picnic, you know, in his shirt sleeves. And so there was, what to me was interesting about FDR was, yes, you had the question about picturing him with his, in terms of his disability, but you also just had this real anxiety about the candid nature of photography and how this new kind of mode of photography would picture him.
So much for the county fair in Iowa, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So let's move on to the social media president. And oh my gosh, there's so much to say about Obama's rise coincident with online news and the point where social media really took root. And I guess later we'll be talking about Obama and more about his, his relationship with the camera and his charisma. But the way you frame that point in time is by looking at the broad importance of the White House Flickr site and how it encompasses strategy and control, as well as curation and also legacy. Could you elaborate on some of those functions?
Yeah, so I always joke that one of the reasons I hate writing about the present is because it's always changing. And so in deciding to write about Obama, that was a challenge, right? And also just how do you encapsulate all of the ways that Obama was photographic and is photographic, right, still. So by deciding to focus on the Flickr site, I wanted to think about that outlet as a way to understand kind of what social media did to photography, and then how social media in turn made presidents photographic. So I talk in the book about a number of things about that feed. I talk about Pete Souza's incredible photographs, the way that he made that archive available in real time, but it was very much still a chronicle for posterity. I talk about a little bit about the photos as really a kind of PR function, a way to bypass the mainstream media in many cases. And there was a lot of criticism of that, I think, at the time. But what these next couple images I wanted to talk about today highlight is something that's a little more implicit in that Flickr archive of Obama White House photos, but one that's really relevant to the conversation about what social media did to photography. And that is how the Flickr site also serves as a kind of accidental archive of things like the selfie. So here in this image, we have, this is an image made, I think, in a diner in Iowa in 2010. And you see, we would look today and see this is Obama posing with this woman for a selfie, but please notice her phone. It's like the old school flip phone. And she's got it turned around because there's no front facing camera yet. So you have this moment, it's not the greatest photo Pete Souza ever took, but it's in the book because to me, it's so interesting. The other thing is that the caption to this photo does not call it a selfie. So even the term wasn't really in vogue yet, although later images in that Flickr site and the captions use the idea of, use the term selfie. So we can contrast this with this, which is the bigger version of the image that's on the cover of my book. And one of the reasons why I wanted that image on the cover is I wanted to show just the kind of accumulation of digital stuff, right, all around the president. And so here you have a guy posing, presumably putting himself in the picture. He's got his camera way up, right? You see all of these people with their phones making images of Obama. And so you just get the sense that just a few years later, something's really, really changed about not just the way that we picture presidents, but how we think of photography and the way we use photography ourselves. And that was really, really interesting to me. But yeah, there's like 5 million different things you could say about Obama. And that's just kind of one little snapshot. So how are we on time here? I'm wondering, should we kind of, we want to leave some time for Q&A.
Yeah,
do you want to kind of skip through some of the other presidential images, and which ones do you want to highlight, Michael? Because we're going to kind of transition to more contemporary images of presidents now.
Yeah, we did co-curate a set from the last 4 presidents. And yeah, I think we can pick and choose. Again, what's so interesting about your book and is so different, I think, than what we do, the pictures and what you and I do together is just like how there's this focus on the medium versus the media, and the difference between visual values versus visual representation. And your book just like moves away, or moves past semiotics and the political narrative, or at least puts it into this larger context where we really see one of the things you really emphasize is how much it does become something you have to contend with. You know, like how do you cannot avoid the camera, and you cannot avoid the whole issue of, you know, creating an image. So, I mean, probably George Bush is a really good place to start because, well, I mean, in my mind, I think Bush somewhat failed as an actor, and maybe because he did not have the chops to really rise to the level of his director, Karl Rove, who just kept putting him in these amazing situations and set him up to like really hit the home run ball time and time again. And it just didn't feel like, you know, that Bush could pull it off. I don't know if that's what, you know, you get that same impression from this really early image of Bush clearing brush on the ranch in Crawford or not.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you and I first connected, we connected through your blog, which really was one of the only places where you could find any kind of analysis of contemporary political photos. And so I immediately glommed on and was paying very close attention, especially with the Bush-Kerry race later. But yeah, and so the narratives that I think you helped people to see about Bush and then about later presidents, you know, I think that bears out. And you know, we can think about kind of what a photo op is, right? And so this is clearly a photo op. And, you know, it's kind of the working man president as active leader, you know, this sort of image of, you know, I need to show that I'm the regular guy, right? The one you want to have a beer with. But, you know, the photo op can turn wrong. Right. And for folks who don't immediately trigger, this image doesn't immediately trigger for them. This is a couple of different photographers. Some press were invited on Air Force One when George W. Bush flew over the devastation caused by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And if you Google this image now, what you see is a lot of stories about George W. Bush saying, I should never have posed for these photos because they made me look detached. You know, we might say they highlighted the failure of the response. So yeah, Michael, I mean, you know, you talk a lot about these kinds of images within the political calculus too.
Well, you know, if you remember, like Bush was really taken to task for the insensitivity, where he was not on the ground, that he would be doing a flyover, and it was just so obvious that it was a photo op. Maybe, you know, the strain in the neck in the first photograph, you know, you kind of start to see some hints of that too. And then you have this great point where Manny Garcia, I think, who took one of the photographs, you know, called it the white knuckle photo. Like you see that strain in his hand. And, you know, in some respects, I think that the reason why people you know, really flipped out over these pictures or really saw through them was because also, you know, Bush's standing with the public was really, you know, crashing at this point. You know, he was at 90% approval rating, 85% right after 9/11. And now with the Iraq War at peak level, and when this photo was taken, 2005, and people so many soldiers coming back injured and no plan over there. Forget about like that the whole thing was contrived in the first place. You know, this was pretty much, I think, this visually, you know, the straw that broke the camel's back. And, you know, he went down to, in 2016, went down to 40% approval rating. And when he left office, he was at 19, which is, you know, just unheard of. But, you know, people, I think, will give you a lot of latitude if the big picture bears out and the character seems true. But, you know, people were savvy enough, you know, at this point to know that, you know, that this wasn't working.
Yeah, and this kind of dialectic between access and wanting to control the image, right? Like from their perspective, a big fail for sure. Yeah. Why don't we, in the interest of time, skip over Obama, since we've talked a tiny bit about him already, and and then maybe get to his successor, we'll just give you a little visual look at Obama as we go by here. And here's Donald Trump. So what do we say about Donald Trump in photography?
Well, what I love about this is that Trump really had his act down by the time he became president. As much as he drove certain people crazy, he was all about kitsch. And I think that he was really also about subverting all rituals and all dignities of this perceived elite. And so, it's so interesting that, here he is reveling in front of this burger banquet, and we bring in the junk food, and again, master deception and distraction and spectacle after he forced the government shutdown. He's got this football team coming in that won the college championship, and this went crazy on this was like catnip, or fast food, junk food to social media. It was, you kind of forget about the substance pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to think about Trump and Twitter, and we don't tend to think a lot about the photographic Trump. But this is such a good example of, it's just quintessential, right? For all the reasons you just said. One of the things that I found really interesting during the Trump era was the way that mainstream media photographers pictured him. So for example, Doug Mills from the New York Times famously said that Obama was the most photogenic president he ever photographed, but Trump was the most iconic. And this image really sticks out to me for so many reasons. I mean, you and I talked a little bit as we're preparing for tonight about this. What are ways to think about it? But here you kind of get Trump as a visual form that, after we've been looking at him for so long, we recognize the silhouette instantly, right? We recognize the gesture, we recognize the shadow, we recognize the hair in the back of the head. And one of the things that made me think of when I saw this image again was my buddy John Quincy Adams, who said that he thought that the silhouette was a more accurate likeness of a person than the photograph. And you have to really wrap your head around why he might have thought that. But then you see an image like this and you kind of go, this is actually a pretty accurate likeness of Trump and what we know about him, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Should we look at one Biden picture real quickly, or do you want to jump right?
Yeah, why don't we do a Biden, and then we'll have a good amount of time for some Q&A, because it looks like there's some questions in the Q&A. Yeah. Okay. So which one you want to do? The first one? Oh, I also just wanted to highlight this, right? The patented gesture, right? You see it everywhere. The jazz hands.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. There's a lot of ways to read that metaphor.
Yeah.
So this photograph was taken the night of the inauguration, and it really, it's doing a lot of things. One thing it's doing is telling us that we're not in the grip of Trump anymore. So it kind of actually plays right back to, the hands and the gaslighting, both in those other two pictures. So here, Biden has created has such a established and a known character. So in some ways, I think today it's really inoculating him. So what we see is this, you see the empathy and the care and intimacy. These are like now the new coins of the realm, and just like kind of clicked in instantly. And where Trump was preoccupied by the power and luster of the office and his own reflection, this picture is so incredible for epitomizing the complete opposite. It's candid as opposed to staged. The fact the mirror is so prominent and at the same time incidental is incredibly ironic, as is the grand chandelier and the presidential seal, both actually out of focus. I mean, we're not in Trump land anymore. And by the way, when did you ever see anyone else in Trump's eyes?
Yeah. That gaze, right, that the photograph captures. I think you nailed it. It's candid in a way that, if if a photograph gives you insight into relationships, right? You see behind the presidential seal here for sure. Yeah, yeah. So should we turn to some questions? I'm going to stop sharing the slideshow, and so if people will give me a second to kind of get us back oriented. Let me see. Here's a question that maybe we could both answer, Michael. How have your experiences looking at these images affect how you take photographs or handle being the subject of photographs in your own life? I'm going to make you answer that one first.
Besides looking at a lot of photographs, I know a lot of photographers and sometimes back channel with them. So I really enjoy taking photographs and feel like I have a little bit of acumen with the craft, but at the same time, I keep a very clear and healthy separation and distance between whatever I shoot and all these images I'm looking at, because these photographers they channel truth. They are poets. They, if you look on Instagram, which now in the last couple of years has become really like go-to place for the photographs that I write about. This is where news photographers, especially photo press, they're posting more impressionistic images, and those pictures are so revealing. So, but I have a very deep respect for what they do and people who practice that craft.
Yeah, I think you can see over my shoulder, I have a speed graphic. I've started collecting old cameras, and then some of them I can't use the speed graphic. It's way too complicated for me. One of those moments where I wish I still had my dad around, because he was a journalist and a reporter, and he used to have to shoot his own news stories, and he would be able to pick this up and know exactly what to do with it. But I've started investigating and learning some 19th century photography techniques, and I've also been playing with things like the Brownie camera. So the whole idea of returning to film is really fun to me, because it's now called so-called alt photography, by the way. So anything that's not digital is alternative. So those of us of a certain age, that's kind of a fun thing to think about, that we're now all alternative if we're interested in film. But I play with that, and that definitely, I think, shapes the way I understand how these different technologies work. Like, understanding how 19th century photographs were made and printed really helped me figure out that part of the book, I think in ways it wouldn't have otherwise. I'm seeing a couple photos here, or a couple questions here. Adams and Teddy Roosevelt, I'll just answer these. Adam, the question is, it's interesting how sharp his face is in that daguerreotype we showed, but his hands are blurred. He couldn't keep them still over the time of the exposure. Yeah, and in fact, in the diary, his account of that visit was that he was sick that day. It was March. It was snowing in Washington, D.C. And he talked about how his hands were frozen from the cold. So there's a kind of bodily component to that image. And when you read the diary, you really see that. And that's interesting. So he couldn't keep his hands still, probably because he was trying to warm them up, And then I did skip past Teddy Roosevelt, and someone asked a question about what would be the reason for that. Teddy Roosevelt appears in the book. We didn't talk about him substantively, but I do talk about him as a kind of inheritor of this timely photography. And also I talk a little bit about him as someone who is especially skilled at the photo op. So there's an argument, there's a journalism historian who argues that Roosevelt might have actually created the first photo op because he was supposed to be photographed signing a Thanksgiving proclamation, and the photographer didn't show up, and he didn't sign the proclamation until the photographer came to show up. So there's an argument out there, that Teddy Roosevelt was the photo op guy, which I think is kind of interesting.
Paul's question is, when and how did you start seeing White Houses really grapple with photography and begin to start exerting control? I know we touched on that a little bit, but maybe you can expound on that, and then maybe we can also talk about it more in the present day.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Paul. we move, I think, as we move from the late 19th into the 20th century is where we really see that. And so McKinley's interesting for other reasons apart, so not just because he's dead, but because when he was president, they set up a pretty professionalized press operation. And so I think that's one place that I would look for sure. And then as you move, especially into the 1920s, two presidents, Harding and Coolidge, were both very, very skilled and amenable. I wouldn't say Coolidge was skilled. He was actually pretty awkward, but they were both really amenable to the photo op. And at this point, you also have to realize that the newsreel is emerging. And so film starts to matter as well. So it isn't only photography, you've also got film. So I would say those are kind of the main places where you see it in terms of the previous context. And then later, the critique of Obama is really that they just tried to control everything. And I talk a little bit in the book about how they got real pushback from the White House photo press about not providing access to moments that they felt that they should have been able to photograph. And the White House was saying, oh no, these were not public moments. But then they would release a Sousa photo. So there's always this push-pull. And I think it played out, especially with Obama, because the photographers really started seeing what Sousa was doing and how often Sousa's photos were being treated as news. Like they were being treated like photojournalism, even though they were coming straight out of the White House, like a press release, basically.
They did it so seamlessly, and people were so unfamiliar with the difference between social media or online media, and then this, the fact all of a sudden that the president and the White House were able to just go straight to, straight to publication. And but those pictures from the inauguration, the Obamas in the elevator, like no one else was in there, all the way to like the Rosa Parks picture, where I found one tiny little picture shot by an AP photographer who was like kind of like a little bit put out, because you can see in the photograph that there's actually a rope line around the bus in the museum in Detroit, and all the news photographers are out there. Well, Pete got to jump up on the bus and shoot the picture of Obama sitting, in this way that echoes Rosa Parks. So, I mean, they were so adept at it that, it's every picture of Obama was seemed candid, and they were very stagey, and for being able to pull that off, it was astounding.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and the extent to which it kind of people got normalized to it is really interesting. So, Obama did Flickr, well then Trump had to do Flickr, and Trump's Flickr was basically a giant image dump that was largely uncurated. And now Biden has Flickr because you just have to have Flickr now, even if not everyone is kind of using it in the same sort of way or with the same effect, at least at this point. Let's see, we've got probably time for a couple more questions. Let's see, so Jordana, hi Jordana. There's kind of two questions that I think I think you meant to have them together, Jordana. So how does the photographic representation compare to other forms of representation, cinematic or painted? I'm thinking of the National Portrait Gallery portraits in particular as official representations. That is such an interesting question. I'm immediately thinking about, like the Kehinde Wiley portrait of Barack Obama, the painting, the official painting, contrasted with photographic images. What's interesting to me in the most recent years is, I think because of Obama and because of the portrait of Michelle by Amy Sherald, I feel like there's been a kind of renaissance in the wider public's recognition of portraiture as a kind of singular art form. And Jordana is an art historian, so she could probably say much more about this than I can, but that to me is really interesting. Wiley, for example, works from photographs, but obviously elaborates them in all kinds of really interesting ways. You know, it's funny when you go to I can't remember what it's called. I think it's just the Hall of Presidents. When you go to the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian, and there's a whole section on presidents, you get the whole variety. There's photographs. You can see John Quincy Adams's daguerreotype that I showed you. You get all kinds of portraits. And they're really mixed together in a way that I don't think sorts out some of those differences very much. So I'm not really answering the question, but I think it is a really interesting question.
And Katie's question, which is also a great question, what might you be expecting? And after 100 some odd days, what are you seeing during Biden's administration?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So for Biden, you know, I mean, you and I talked a little bit about that great Evan Vucci photo, which, you know, said just really highlighted. It was just kind of like, boom, here's a sea change, right? We now have a grandfather, a family man. We have this candid example, right, of this calmer thing. The other thing that I would say about Biden that I've noticed and gotten pretty interested in is, especially if you do look at their Flickr site, which I've been cruising a little bit here and there, is the way that they're foregrounding Vice President Harris. And that makes sense for a number of reasons. You know, bless his heart, Joe Biden's an older man, right? He's not the youthful White House of the Obama family and children, certainly. But also, you know, I think they're taking really seriously the pioneering nature of Kamala Harris's role as vice president, as the first woman vice president, as the first woman of color vice president. Her spouse, the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, is featured in more of these images than you would imagine. You know, Biden didn't show up a lot in the Flickr feed comparatively for the Obama White House, but we're seeing a lot of Kamala Harris. And in particular, we're seeing her partnered with Biden, pictured as a peer of Biden. We see them kind of at eye level a lot, or walking together, or appearing at public events. And I think that's a message they're trying to send about the kind of vice president she is and the kind of relationship they have. But it also feels to me to be very much tied up with this idea of we're in a different moment politically, where we now have a woman in this executive office for the first time, and we want to highlight that and show that. So that's one of the things that I would say I'm really seeing.
Yeah, I just turned in a draft of an article for Columbia Journalism Review on the Biden optics first 100 days. And what's really interesting is how much the visuals seem to be in sync with this really tightly controlled strategy of keeping Biden out of the spotlight, actually, to really then really focus on and it seems to sync with a lot of the themes, you know, the themes of humility. It's not about me, it's about you. And what you're seeing in a number of the images that are being taken by the DC press and especially showing up on their Instagram are photographs where you see Biden very much like a peripheral figure in the photograph, almost on the margins, but not in a way that the old Biden, who was making gaffes all the time and kind of did goofy things, would be marginalized. But in fact, it seems like, especially after Trump, you know, which was just him front and center all the time, this like Biden seems to be being, you know, representing this kind of humility by foregrounding Kamala Harris, or by the photographers showing all of Section 60 at Arlington, where Biden was there and laid a wreath. But, you know, it's about the other, it's about us, it's about, and so, you know, I don't know how it's going to play out over time and if they're going to be able to maintain that discipline, but so far, this humility seems to be really, you know, manifesting itself visually, and the press photographers seem to be really amplifying it. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of first 100+ day snapshot of it anyway, right? Yeah, I think that is very much what we're seeing. So probably, I think we need to sign off. We promised an hour. We promised you presidential happy hour. So Thank you so much, Michael, for doing this with me. You and I have been doing these kinds of things together for a long time now, and it's sometimes we're just talking to each other, and now it's great to be able to talk to actual other live people in an audience.
Well,
and,
it's an honor. I should have had my copy sitting right here so I could hold it up. But like I said, the book is really powerful, and I've learned so much from it, and it's always a pleasure, to really sit down and just talk about images with you. So thank you.
Yes, I agree. Thanks everybody for being here. We know that you have many other things you could be doing, and it really means a lot. Heather, is there anything else you wanted to say? I know there's going to be a recording at some point, so if folks missed things.
Yep, there will be a recording. I should have it up on our YouTube channel tomorrow. You'll get an email from Zoom that will have a link to our YouTube channel, and it'll also have the discount code in there. There's a link in the chat box, but it's FIN40, and you can just go to the University of Illinois Press website and you can learn even more about photographic presidents. So thank you guys so much. This was wonderful. Have a great night.
Thanks everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.